everybody. Thanks for tuning in to our weekly poetry series. I'm Nicole, the manager at It Again Bookstore, and I'm joined today by poets Bridget Lowe and Stephen Kleinman. You can order Bridget's books from our store, Read It Again, with links provided in the comments later, and Stephen's book will be out next January. If you aren't in Georgia, we can still ship to you, or we encourage you to reach out to your local indie bookstores for anything you might need. The way the formatting is going to work tonight, each poet is going to read for 15 minutes, followed by a discussion on craft. Feel free to make comments or ask questions throughout, and we'll respond to them at the end of the reading. Bridget is going to read first. Bridget Lowe is the author of the poetry collections My Second Work and At the Autopsy of Václav Nijinsky, both from Carnegie Mellon University Press. Her poems have been published in The New Yorker, The New Republic, Best American Poetry, Poetry, American Poetry Review, and elsewhere. She lives in Kansas City. All right, Bridget.
Hello, thank you so much, Nicole, and all at Read It Again for having me, and Stephen for having me along to read with you before your debut, which is absolutely beautiful. So I am really excited to be here. It's really surreal not knowing who's out there, but welcome. Thank you for being here. It's Friday night, and I appreciate your presence, even though you are invisible to me right now. So I am the author of my second work, which is new. This came out in February, and At the Autopsy of Václav Nijinsky, which came out in 2013. And I met Stephen for the first time right after this had come out at Bread Loaf, and really, really excited to be here tonight with him. So I'm going to read from the new book, and forgive any little awkwardness that arises. It's just from this new format we're all getting used to, it being at our houses. I did get to read Stephen's book. It is coming out a little later this year, but I wanted to structure my reading tonight as a response to Stephen's book. Hopefully that's okay with him, but I do see a lot of overlap in what we're both writing about, and hopefully that will become clear as I read the poems that I chose to read. So I did choose them with intention, and the first thing I'm going to read is the epigraph from my second work. So it is actually from a tapestry from the 18th century, 1732. And it was a sampler that I saw at the American Folk Art Museum. And there was a whole wall of these needlepoint tapestries, which are common from the time. There was nothing particularly remarkable, but there was this one down at the bottom by a young girl named Catherine Park, because it was typical to put your name and the date in it, and then to put in the needlepoint which one it was to mark your progress. So this particular needlepoint was her second needlepoint that she'd accomplished, and it had a poem throughout it that I haven't been able to source or find anywhere, and I like to believe it was original to her. I don't know, but this was the poem. This is my second work. Although the wood be wild, I was set to hunt the buck and doe, being but a child. So that inspired this book. The first poem I'm going to read is These Are But the Outskirts of His Ways. And there is a poem in Stephen's book called The Machine, and it has a line that says, "Some of us made wishes, I made a wish." And this poem is about, it's spoken from the point of view of a child who knows that resources are slim, and so has adjusted their longing accordingly in the hopes of making as little trouble as possible. These are but the outskirts of his ways. I could kill you, he said, and I knew it was true, but I played for him upon my instrument of longing, a plastic kazoo, nothing too fancy. And when I rode, he rode, right there beside me. Look up, he said, a canopy of trees. but I saw a steel trap jaw on a loaded spring, triangular teeth, each 10 feet wide at least. I cried at this point. Flowers. Wholly disinteresting. I colored them anyway, 5 loops held together by a balled up center. I stood straight as a flower in the slap of the sun. The sun wore black sunglasses, so I couldn't see his soul. An advertisement for tropical things, vacations and juices, a spiky ball on a chain, going slow like a lasso around God's head. My song a jingle, rising like heat, clinging to corners, begging God down, begging, one more time around the block before dinner. This next poem is the understudy, and it's written still in the world of the child who is not able to discern between the value of the sources of comfort that are offered to them amid particular traumas. As a kid, you don't know if what brings you comfort is good or bad, or just brings you comfort. The understudy. High spring, the sounds at their utmost registers. I am building a language with my bike. Shame makes the wheels go. Shame pumps its sick jet fuel. I am flying over tiny hills with motes of purple flowers. My fantasy is evidence. My fantasy is a white skull gleaming through a bed of mulch. I let go of the handlebars and beat my chest with shame's gorilla fist until the trees get in my way. Nancy Drew before me, Nancy Drew behind me, Nancy Drew on all sides of me. Lord, hear my prayer. I remember there are days I would just not even get out of bed and read Nancy Drew's all day, sun up to sundown, and it was just like the best way to get out of the world. This poem is, I think, in nice conversation with Stevens. That's how I should say it. It's in conversation with Stevens' poems. No One is Proud, which is in the latest American Poetry Review and available online, and just a perfect poem. No One is Proud and The Martyr. Those are both good thematic poems, I think, as well, that represent a lot of what Stevens' book is doing. So I wanted to read In a Suburb. And it's really long lines, so I have to hold it this way because it's how we fit them all for the book. And then the trees gave up too. So it was final. A kind of agreement on the status of things. The rabbit, however, was confident with his angle. He retracted for a millisecond before diving nose first through the grass, parting the grass like hair, dragging something tiny back. Hunger, hunger, a little thirst, nothing else. I was jealous. I was jealous of every animal I met. A little thirst, nothing else. A day spent searching for a makeshift dish in the sun. A bottle cap that landed ridge side up. A drop of rain filled it to the edges. My pages are stuck together. And I, everywhere at once, Tom Thumb-like in my capability of shrink. I borrowed her riding boots made of rubber, and happily I would wade through the brown water, and I was everywhere at once. I found a dead grackle. It was like someone poured gasoline over his head. Depending on which angle you looked from, you could see purple or green, or both at once, in a translucent sheen that seemed divine. But his perfectly ominous eye made the meaning complete. His shape designed solely for a Halloween night. My mother inside redecorated our living room 100 times. changed the placement of a lamp just so, while my brother built a cell in the basement with a mattress on the floor and walls of bed sheets tied to the beams in the ceiling, and a record player, the Lemonheads and the Wall on repeat. And I was a saint. I was capable of everything at once. They patted my head. Thank God, our bizarro version of heaven almost complete. We loved you, we hated you, the way you made us laugh. Abundance the answer to every particular lack. The dog got kicked for jumping the fence the 100th time. Everything bad happened again and again. We had to teach her a lesson, he said. Then tears of joy, the dog came back. She would carry her rigid body in a swift trot around the pine tree in the backyard, ignoring us. A kind of agreement on the status of things. We went to Disney World once. Mom wore the ears for the entirety of the fugue. Nothing equals the equator at dusk. We watched fireworks explode with dye above the Buena Vista Castle. I was 10 in the picture and confused, holding two things in my mind at once, like two awful kickballs. The spool at my center, with all the string already pulled tight. My brother posing in a leather Indiana Jones hat and clutching a whip, squinting his eyes to the Orlandian sun. He's about to be done. We kind of already know it. And my little sister, not even mentioned until this last line. I think the flip side of prolonged martyrdom is revenge fantasies. And I think Medea is kind of the avatar for revenge fantasy. So this poem is called Nurse of Medea. And I'm interested in Medea's story as sort of an extreme grief reaction. And so this is Nurse of Medea. I'm imagining the nurse who opens the play, Medea, talking to Medea and trying to kind of soothe her about being left by Jason. Jason. What's a name like Jason anyway? Ordinary as elder care and a season spent on Little League. Foam hats ejaculated across a field of domestic dreams. A psychopath with a hockey mask and his carry-on of little pills. A mother's love distributed in equitable shares with each blow of the axe. The unspeakable abuses of summer camp enter the hotel rooms of middle managers in pharmaceutical sales. Friday again. The husband is stuffing his children in his mouth like chicken fingers. Epic of flashy masculine despair. While the rage of a woman eats her beauty, Jason lives. Just going to read one more imperfect allegory for a situation of which I am not permitted to speak. So this is trying to find ways to speak about what you're not supposed to speak about. And it is using a story by Chekhov called Strider or Kolstomore, which tells the full life of this horse in a short story. So it's using the horse as a way to get going. Imperfect allegory for a situation of which I am not permitted to speak. 1, the breathlessness of sinking into flesh, like a sleeping bag filled with jam. She always seemed a little slow to them, the way she wouldn't turn her head upon hearing her name. She had the ornament of learning, which is not learning itself. It is following directions. Rose did. A turn around the concrete pole at the end of the gravel road, then back. Swaying toward a fuzz of light, like a dandelion head, drunk on the cold air, a distant barn she could not reach. How much farther is it now, she said. We don't know, they said, not one of us knows a thing. What if, she said, I left peacefully? Look, they said, a slab of salt propped against a distant fence. Help yourself, they said, but Rose could not. 2. Poor Rose. She got her degree in humanities, and 84K later, a frat boy sat on the squat brown cask of her tired body, pointing out the sorry zigzag of her dugs, those pickled slits that gave no milk, and the rotted tooth that no one would attend to. So her breath came out a reeking blast, like last week's trash blown through a tube of paper towels. And then the rock her yellowish eye did not catch. Rose stepped again and again in every wrong spot until the movement stopped. Poor Rose, she did not know her own size. Like most girls, she died from this mistake. 3. Believe it or not, the complications of foreign commerce were not lost on Rose, nor the fluctuations of the stock market, which Rose boiled down to simple masculine fear, measurable as menses, as they consulted spreadsheets, cosmic as the Milky Way, their suit sleeves revealing just a hint of gold and wrist hair. 4. Rose counted her possessions in her head. One imaginary falcon and one wayward cow that roamed beneath the crabapple trees on certain afternoons. How human she felt. You have no idea. Perfectly distinct from men, Rose sat in the congregated straw, watching them prepare for it. A blue tarp spread as if it were a birth. She saw herself being pulled through herself, head first. She was swimming and flying all at once. All this time, what she imagined was pride was fear. All this time, she was tied with jump rope. She didn't know. All this time, she was blindfolded. All this time, she believed that God loved her. Not just loved her, but loved her, loved her. She thought they were star-crossed lovers that got caught. She drank a little poison, the heft of God, 1,000 sorrows on her back. What happened, happened. In one fell act, brutal and permanent, whether anyone believes it or not. And then she was running in the actual woods, a girl. Thank you.
That was very good. Thank you. We're going to follow that up with Stephen's poetry for another 15-minute reading. Stephen Kleinman is the author of Life Cycle of a Bear, or will be when it comes out, or already the author, but it will come out soon. Winner of the 2019 Philip Levine Poetry Prize. His poems have appeared in the American Poetry Review, the Gettysburg Review, Iowa Review, Oversound, American Literary Review, Tikkun, and elsewhere. He has received support from the Bread Loaf Writers Conferences and earned his MFA from the University of Maryland. He currently serves as a contributing editor at the American Poetry Review, where he co-hosts the American Poetry Review podcast. He coordinates the Art Alliance Writers Workshop at the University of the Arts, where he teaches poetry. All right, Stephen.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Bridget. I wore out Bridget's first book, writing so many of these poems, and every time I would get lost in writing, I would go back and reread that book. And so please, if you haven't read that, please do. Okay, so these, all of the poems I'm going to read are from Life Cycle of a Bear, which is coming out in January of 2021 with Anhinga Press. This is Portrait Trailer of Cows. I've spent all morning making sense of my goodness. Already at the bottom of the hill, I slowed, coming to the light, and waiting my turn, I thought about obstacles as a sedan lurched into my path. I thought about crushing what was in front of me. I tried to decide how I felt about competition and who deserved what, and what I was willing to do to win. I spend too much time driving around angry, collecting names of towns where I will exile those who have wronged me. Accelerating, I passed a flatbed truck, its cargo of dead cows not quite covered with an orange tarp. I want to describe one cow in detail, its one eye wide open and dripping a thick mucus, flies gathering around the moisture, drinking in their fill, one fly just escaping a festering cut when the tarp slaps down in a gust of wind, but that didn't happen. Sorry, I lost my place because sorry. What must matter here to me now is the truth. Even as I too sometimes want a better story, it matters what I could actually see and why. That I drove past a trailer of slaughtered cows on a country road, and I would not have noticed if I weren't looking in the mirror for a car I thought had cut me off. And all I could see was one cow whose head escaped like a gasp of air from under the tarp, its nose nearly falling off the edge of the truck before I turned back to my life and back to the road. In the moments immediately following, as I drove away, I saw the cow's head come to life. I watched it bounce dead on the trailer. No one is proud. No one is proud of drug addiction or a son with addiction or a cousin who stops calling his mother. No one is proud of accidents. No one is proud their grandmother was mean like a dog, a secret smoker. No one spends Saturdays talking about house painting, how they would have made it pro at house painting if they could have figured out school and going to class more times than not. No one is proud as they get hooked on painkillers, wrapping car after car around the same tree. No one I know goes to church and believes much, but it's nice to see everyone no one likes when they can't find a job and spend hours surfing the internet for what might take them away a little, feel a certain way or feel anything at all, even if it's anger. No one likes anger. No one likes losing it at their kids, throwing their kids' toys that were left on the GD ground again. No one likes slamming doors, broken door jams, leaving the television on for hours, passing in and out of sleep, watching the game. And what kind of game is it anyway? The warm hours fading when someone comes home in a tone already at it again. I don't want to hear it, have already heard it enough anyway. Let's have it out, have the fight. No one wants to have. My parents were throwers. They didn't brag when the doors slammed shut and someone turned again, needing to make clear what they said, which was always, I'm scared. I'm so scared. I'm so very scared we might not make it. So there's a number of poems in this book that are about a really good friend of mine who I was really close with in high school and lost track of him. And then he died a couple years ago. And this is an elegy for him. It's called Elegy in Anger. So what, he died. So what, before we knew they'd cremated him? So what, there were no pictures, and I spent the first week searching the internet to prove he'd lived. So what, I wanted to see what he looked like when his kids, looked like with his kids, what he and his wife looked like I wanted to know if his family liked him, if you could tell they liked him in their faces. Have you heard someone calls to say, and I say yes, and then someone else calls, and someone else after that? So what, at Christmas at my brother's house, someone from high school makes a joke about how he probably was dead without knowing he was dead. So what, I said, he is dead. And we laughed. Didn't he die in the truck with his father, kicking empties out of the open door so our feet could hit the floor mats? Or was it in the basement where we'd get drunk and he stole a car to get smokes? I went for a run today. So what? Am I not allowed to step heavily like the elephant I've become as the orchestra of grasshoppers sang in the tall yellow grass? I ran down a path to a river and stood panting at the temperature as the temperatures turned and fog rolled in. I have always tried to love the hardest men, the unlovable men. I started early. I would not do it differently. The picture I eventually found is of him in front of a house, backlit, wearing a mask. He was a house painter. He made the world more ordered and beautiful. He looked like a monster from a nightmare movie in the moment the fun is about to begin. This is a poem called There Were Problems on Every Level, and it's loosely based on this shop that my dad had when I was like 4, which was right next to a lawnmower repair shop. There were problems on every level. When he lifted me, he tried to be gentle under my arms and in the sockets between my arms, though my shoulders pulled, though his palms were more memory than friction. I looked outside the shop. By the street, there was a pile of tires from discarded lawnmowers, a line of trees you could see through. The blacktop was destroyed by weeds, making lifelines through the lot, and parts of rusted cars whose bodies were hidden by buildings lay like death itself here or there. I watched a man hobble down the road. It was clear nothing was going well. On the television, reporters reported declining participation in civic activities, or worse yet, made warnings that whatever we chose to view was only a distraction to what was really going on. My mother started running subterfuge with all of us in the back seat of her car. My nostrils were black with dried mucus and sawdust. The picture of me on the wall was of a boy smiling. Then my father returned to his work, mallet in hand. I wore the red mufflers over my ears as he lifted me to the work table to watch as one by one, with a chisel and mallet, he cut off the fingers of his left hand, knocking the wood top of the chisel, the blade resting on each knuckle, his stroke swift and merciful as he worked his way to the end. The body. The body was naked and pink. The body was there for the taking. Bend me here in forgiveness, said the body. Here, bend me in devotion. It was on the run through the city. It was beyond the wall before the government building. It was brick layered onto brick. Bend me here, it said, and so it was bent. We took the body through the streets, even as it ached, even as it exhausted. We took the body by the river, bent in memoriam. We pulled until the body said what it would be like next time. Bend me here some other way, it said. The body on the white back, a bent tulip leaf, the body against the brick of that building where we found it. Leave me here, we expected the body to say, but never leave me, is what it said, the body crawling on its hands and knees like we wanted. I think this is my obligatory 3-poem warning. This is the martyr poem. This may be my favorite poem in the book. Mom is being a martyr again. John feels like a martyr in the morning, but really, he just doesn't want to wake up. Chris decided to be a martyr last night, and this morning we found a snake in his bed. Sometimes when Sam says he feels like a martyr, I want to cut his ear with a plastic serrated butter knife. Sometimes Kristen says she is the only real martyr in the family. Sometimes Peter refuses to do anything but be the martyr. I'm not the martyr often, but when I am, I listen to the eagles sitting on the porch and resting my head against the stucco. When Dad feels like a martyr, he stabs knives into his chest. Every time he leaves the house, I worry he won't return. When Dad loses his job, Mom announces that dinner will be a martyr tonight. She claps her hands over her head. Sometimes she goes for drives and comes back excited about the rain falling in the fields. We've had too much of it this year. The corn isn't growing, she says. If you were here, you would see what is so exciting. Even the fields these days are martyrs. Yes, but maybe. Props are great. Maybe if you're thin and hairless, maybe if you're wealthy, wear polo shirts open at the collar, maybe if you've planted political signs in your front yard. Yes, sir, we'll be voting. Maybe if you believe in voting, if you say you believe without even an air of sarcasm, yes, it matters if I vote. Maybe if you always tie your shoes, maybe if your pants are not wrinkled or unwrinkled, meaning pressed or ironed, maybe if you're the sort of guy who irons his khakis every morning before you go to the office, maybe if the office does something good for the world, think a job that ends with sector, maybe if you drive the right car, if you don't drive at all, but instead insist on riding your bike, maybe if you ride in the bike lane and never cut anyone off, maybe if you cut off only the right people, the ones with the wrong bumper stickers, maybe if you sing, I've got the right stuff, baby, as you cut off the right people and bike in the middle of the lane defensively, maybe if you're what people call a defensive person. Maybe if you're defensive when attacked, but also a bit aggressive, no nonsense, take no prisoners. Maybe if you're like a dog, maybe if like a dog, you've learned to be aggressive at the right moments. Maybe if you've learned to take over when it is required, if you know what is required at what time, if you're the one your friends want talking to the cops when the cops come. Maybe if when the cops come, you're in control, you do a two-step, you twirl and jump. Maybe if you jump right at the right time, maybe then, yes, maybe then they'll pull you onto the stage and ask you to dance. Thank you so much for listening. This is the last poem. It's called You Might Ask How We Made It Submit. You might ask how we got to the river, or what we found there, and weren't we worried someone might have beat us to it, found it first by the flood wall, that they might have waited for us, recognized us, turned on us. You might correct me, say back then the river was undeveloped with its current condos and storefronts and walkways and gardens. You might point to the one building growing moss up its brick exposed back. You might say, not unaccusingly, that if we arrived when the trains arrived, whistling and pouting the way trains do, we would be nearly all to ourselves, and daylight as the shadows of the overpass and the music of the highway stretched towards us, alone with the fumes and whatever the green algae on top of the water smelled like that day, this day, any day. You might ask, were we alone then as you are now? You might ask, did we do it out of anger, or was it out of fear or resentment or some other abstraction you imagined? You might ask what we got out of it. Pointedly, you might ask, did it get me off? Did I get off on the way it looked, or coward? You might ask, did I insist on submission? You might ask if at first it looked alive. You might ask, did I think it was alive, even in the end, knowing what it looked like later, past the end after the end, if you will, or what it sounded like when I called it, when its mother was dying, when it couldn't speak for longer than 3 minutes. You might ask what the terms were, the penalties for disagreeing or not disagreeing, for going against, for loyalty or disloyalty. You might ask, have I walked there recently, where the city has grown up around our youth? And I would say, yes, it is different. Graffiti on the trains, tall glass buildings and new glass buildings. The city, I would say, is a new place, and so am I. The line of flesh breaking through the moss, a bit of blood and gut vine growing up the building's spine, and the music of something breaking. And I know what we agreed to was complete, was devastating and imprisoning. I will say, you'll lose equally what you gained here. You wanted me to tell you what we wanted. We wanted everything. In the pre-muzzle morning and in the afternoon, when it was still pre-human, when its sounds were bird-like and its shapes unclear. Thank you.
That was very good. Thank you. I loved the rhythm and the specificity of your poetry. It was great. We have a long comment from Katie in the comments to get us started. She says, I wonder if you both can talk a little about writing about violence without sensationalizing it. Your speakers seem decidedly measured and even-keeled. More and more often, it seems like poems do the opposite. Their speakers lean into the emotional experience of the violence they witness/endure, as opposed to observing and describing it as objectively as possible. I'm interested in the absence of that in both of your poems. Is that something that you guys feel that you can speak to?
Do you want to go ahead, Stephen? Yeah.
You can start.
Okay, that definitely makes sense to me, Katie. I think the thing about actual trauma, not to throw that word around, but to use it accurately, that is a result of witnessing or experiencing violence is a dissociative response. Not to get too psychological about it, but I do think that for me, poetry is a place where the goal is like constantly trying to get closer to that original feeling that has been sort of taken from me because whatever event was so overwhelmingly terrifying in its violence that you can't process it in that moment, and maybe ever. So for me, poetry has been a space where I can actually at least attempt to get back toward that. But that's interesting, the way that you're coming at it is saying maybe there's some strength there to be able to hold it at arm's length and look at it and examine it. And in some ways, I think it probably does make for better writing, and it makes for a harder life too. So that's just my initial take on that. Stephen, do you have anything?
I'm a guy, and like I think I'm just fascinated with violence. Like I grew up with a lot of violence and the threat of violence, and and I think some of what's left over is the subject of violence. It's not actually like the specificity of a moment as much as it is this, like, I'm fascinated by what violence as a society we deem unacceptable, and where we are completely okay with violence that I'm like, how is that different? And so I spend a lot of time just thinking about just violence. And so I guess it becomes more of a subject than like a specific event in my work often. I can't see the long question anymore, but it was such a good question. I hope that answered it.
I think that worked. There's another question in the comments that says, in your poems, how do you know what not to cut?
Who asked that question?
Frederick Durst.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Well, I feel like I figured out what not to cut in poems by playing a lot of cards, and just remembering to never cut Geraldo's sausage, mostly. I think that answers that question, but we can also answer it truthfully.
Yeah.
That's like, I know there's a very like inside, I asked a similar question in a reading, and it related to a card game that some of us, I think, who are on this call might play. But like a real answer to the question is if it doesn't have music. I mean, if it has music, then I don't cut it, and if it doesn't, then it's probably gone. Like if it doesn't sound right.
Would you agree with that?
I honestly, I don't know how to articulate that gut feeling yet. It's a great question, but I have no idea. It's just you just know, I guess. I never bring anything back. I know that. I mean, when it's gone, it's gone. But it's a good. Oh, thank you, Fred Durst.
Did you guys have any questions for each other?
Go ahead. You start.
Yeah, I'm still curious about sort of evasion and writing about what in some ways you're not sure you should write about, or how it feels to have a debut work as, I mean, do you think about your family at all? That's a good place to start with it. Having a debut and that whole thing.
So I got a phone call in early January that I won this award, and I was super excited for 3 days. And then I reread my manuscript and had a complete freak out, because I love my family so much, and they all get to be characters in the book, and it's not them, which I've learned more and more. But that, that's my take, and I don't really get to say that. I think that the evasion question, I was being so incredibly honest in my poems that someone said, what if you say everything but don't say it? Mm-hmm. And I tried that, and that was more interesting.
Definitely.
Maybe this is a similar question, but in your work there seems to be, and maybe evasion is the right phrase, or word, but I was surprised in my second work how often what breaks through is emotional honesty. Like it's the emotions that break through that feel very true to the speaker. So how do you think of evasion, or how to tell a story so that it, is a story and isn't just your life?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it so much, and it's funny because it's not in relationship to this book that just came out, but in how I'm trying to write new poems. And I'm still very much like in the exploratory draft mode, and I'm writing, it's just this constant back and forth for me between what I feel comfortable saying and what I don't feel comfortable saying, and trying to figure out why, and how to make it a good poem at the end of the day. Not just some therapy session, which is going to, give me some kind of mental clarity or whatever. It's like, it has to be weird enough to me. That's always what I'm looking for, which I think when you're talking about music, with what to cut, that's how I relate to it. Does it have the weirdness that feels true? Because I love what you said about saying it all without saying it, because it is a better poem. Like the ways that I was relating to your poems in that way, like the In a Suburb one, which is, you know,
thanks
a lot about my family. I liked that. I was happy when I wrote that poem because I felt that relief of I've said it, but the whole poem is about what I'm not saying. And so it was like, that was a way I could find that I could do it, but I'm trying to find new ways to do it. And so it's heavy on my mind, very heavy on my mind.
Yep.
And I think you do it really beautifully. So
towards the end of my book, there's a sequence of poems that were really the core of the book at the beginning, 4 poems called Bear. And I don't want to decode them for anyone, and partly because I want you to get out of those poems what you get out of those poems. But they were a way to write about something that it felt like I couldn't write about straight, like that the moment was not welcoming to the discussion in those poems, and so then I wrote about Bear. You know, I had this figure, and all of a sudden I could do terrible things to Bear. You know, I could really treat Bear as poorly as I could possibly imagine, and you know, you don't know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And so it's like, it's such an effective tool to talk about what you want to talk, which is the emotion. You want to talk about the truth. And so you just, for me, I just want to find tools to talk about the truth. The actual narrative of anything is not particularly interesting to me. I don't most of the time when I'm reading poems, I can't remember the narrative of them. I don't really care.
Yeah.
That kind of goes towards answering some of the questions in the comments. One was about the title of Life Cycle of a Bear, how you got the title, and another was about the relationship between the speaker of a poem and the poet. So I think you kind of addressed both of those elements.
Well, I will say that Jen Chang gave me Life Cycle of a Bear. I had a title that was much more hammer on the nail, you know, sort of a thing. It tried to make much more of an argument about what I was doing, and which is outside of my project. And so Life Cycle of a Bear, which was a gift, you know, is such a better title than I had.
There are more questions in the comments. One says, can you both speak to the intersection between memory and place? Sense of place become geographies of memory in your poems.
What was that question again? Sorry.
The intersection between memory and place.
I don't know. Can I? I don't appear to be able to. Bridget, do you have any thoughts?
It's something that I think about a lot because I've chosen to live in my hometown. And I've ended up writing quite a bit about being from Kansas City in ways that are surprising to me, even that it keeps coming up. So for me, I often wonder if like my whole inner world would change if I moved somewhere again, which I, you know, definitely moved places in the past, but I've come back and I'm very close to where I grew up, living like 5 minutes from where I grew up. And I don't know. I'm in a state of flux about everything right now, not knowing what it's doing for the writing per se. But for me, it's in there whether I like it or not. So.
There's another question from Richard Hermes that says, for Stephen, 2 questions. One, repetition is clearly important. Do you think about what the function of that repetition is for you? And the second one's sillier, but can you talk about repetition in your poetry and what the function of repetition is? And I think that works for both of you. Both of you had definitely repetition in the poetry.
Well, I will say about the serrated knife that one time my brother cut my ear with a plastic serrated butter knife, and I didn't read the rest of the question, which is probably fine, but like I was just blown away by how slowly it healed. I remember in the moment, because it's such a not sharp tool. Repetition, I mean, it's just, for me, it's about creating a machine, I think, about creating a sort of, a piston that just continues to pump and that you can return to if you need it. And then it also just gives you a great device repetition gives you a great device to abandon. So you can create form and you can abandon form with it. And so it's phenomenal.
Would you agree, Bridget?
Yeah, I think of it as like creating your own drum beat, kind of like you want to make this music on top of it, and you need what Stephen's calling like a piston. For me is kind of a internal drum machine that I can get the rest of the rhythm layered on top of. And it's also very childlike, and it just is appealing. And we grew up learning through repetition, and it just, like, I think plugs into some side of our brain or part of our brain that lights up instantly. And at least it does me. I just I just love it so much. I love it.
I love reading it too in poems. Not that I can't think of any. I should have one in mind, but I also love in poems where I love any form, mostly at the sentence level, that sets up an expectation and meets that expectation, but in a way that is both completely expected and takes you in a completely different direction.
Richard says, thanks for those insightful answers, and that the second question was important. Sorry, Richard. Let's see. There's another question in the comments about, I can't find it. What are some recent books that you guys wish were getting read more? Or what are some things you guys are reading that you think other people should read right now?
Yeah, I'm guilty of the recent part is the company I've been keeping is not super recent, but I did send over some books, Nicole, that I think that were particularly helpful when I was writing this book. But yeah, why don't you go, Stephen?
Right.
I'll think of some recent that I can recommend.
Well, I mean, there's just a number of books that I've been reading and rereading over the last 5 years that I brought up, and one of them is Matthew Dickman's Wonderland. One of them was At the Autopsy of Václav Nijinsky, Bridget's book. I hope people are reading my second work as well, which is great. If I can't sleep, how can I breathe? The Joe Wenderoth book, which blew my mind, from Wave a couple years ago. Hard Child, Natalie Shapiro. Yeah, right. Ellen Bryant Voigt's Headwaters. I mean, that's like Ellen Bryant Voigt's Headwaters is really that's the best book I've ever read in my life. I just love it and go back to it, and
yeah, it's insane.
Yeah, the poem about not wanting to quit smoking is my absolute favorite.
Can you guys talk a little about Headwaters, like why people should read it?
Well,
I have this really, but no, I truly have like a block about talking about poetry I love. Like I can't, like I just am like, you have to just, I get all like physically uncomfortable even trying to describe why someone should like a book of poetry or complimenting poetry. It's a very odd habit of mine. I don't know, maybe someone out there relates, but some things are just, it's just so perfect. I don't know how to talk about it.
I think for me with Headwaters that every poem starts from this relatively small place and small, the one poem that starts, the sign for okay with with your hand is this, and the complications just grow out of it in the way that complications in life grow out of any moment. I love the form. There's no punctuation. That it just is. That she teaches you as she goes how to read the book, which is something that I think I just stole and made my own in different ways in my book, but I don't have a lot of punctuation in my book, and that's because of Headwaters. And just that the arrivals at truth that Ellen Bryant Voigt has are phenomenal. It's a daring, gutsy book. It's you should read it. Read it.
That was
I also through not a new book, but an old book that was new for me, Cruelty by AI, which I guess you pronounce A. And that book is like that's the way to write about violence in that book, just over and over and over again. How violent that book of poems is, and it's always about they're all like they're all, but enough of them are persona poems. They're just taking anyone's perspective. So good.
And I don't think we need to be recent, Bridget. If there's something that you read that inspired your work or something like that, you can talk about those as well.
For me, I have an easier time talking about cultural history, which I love to read and which inspires me so much with what I write. I love thinking about the history of thought and how our thoughts, we like to think that they're unique to us and our imaginations. And I really love the history of thought and how it's changed and how, different things influence that. One of the books that I recommended was Rabelais and His World by Bakhtin. And that's really like a fundamental study on the grotesque. And that was a huge part of my second work to me is a grotesque. That's how I approached it. I don't know if that comes through as much as it was intentional on my part. It doesn't matter, but really understanding what the grotesque is as a literary conceit. It's one of the ways that I understood my own inner life and trying to see where those things meet up. And then Revenge Tragedy is another one I recommended, where a lot of my understanding of Medea's story came from as, different ways to read that. Very interested in the idea of revenge and how it's been portrayed throughout history, throughout culture, especially as, again, there's this overlap between how I experienced the world growing up and feeling this intense pressure because of addiction and alcoholism and things like that in the family. It was like sort of this pressure cooker for this, I need to do all these things this way so that there isn't any extra stress or whatever. And I think that kind of paired with growing up in a Catholic environment and this idea that, even your thoughts are potentially can send you to hell and God can see you at all times. It was like this like total pressure cooker. And I had this really elaborate revenge fantasy that I was always nurturing. And so when I first read about Medea, I was like really excited because I thought like, oh, this is like, she's like getting it out of her system. It's like this grief reaction because she's just been abandoned, and it made a lot of sense to me. So anyway, I find that is the best way for me to work, is to engage with thought And critical theory is not really where I go. I really love cultural history. And I recommended a few books that really helped my thinking in a way that nurtures my writing. And I love poetry so much, I feel like I don't know how to talk about it.
Well, I think you did a great job talking about it tonight. Thank you both for reading so much. And everybody should tune in again next week when we have Marilyn Callett and Maria James Diaz. So we'll see you then. And good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Stephen. Bye, Nicole.
Bye.
Bye.